Opposite Mandela is a book of unique insights into an unexplored aspect of the presidency and leadership of Nelson Mandela. Joining us is the author, Tony Leon. Tony, I never knew what you were going through. I can remember with Paul Asherson,
yes,
our
of course,
late friend, and,
yes,
going back into those years, that the strife, the struggles, the excitement, the interesting things that you put into this book of yours. What got you, though, what motivated you to now chronicle those years, the Mandela years?
Well, I think the real reason was there are no shortage of books on Mandela. His secretary's about to bring one out, his jailer brought one out, his confidants have brought them out, the authorized biography, the unauthorized biography, but no one other than F.W. de Klerk, whose book ends in 1996, had looked at Mandela through the lens of being in opposition to him. And I thought that this was a necessary and an underexplored aspect of both the phenomenon of Mandela's leadership and what it was like to experience it, as we say, up close and personal, both in an affirming way and sometimes, as I do point out here, in a hostile way, because Mandela was a very rounded person. That meant he wasn't a saint, he wasn't a genius, he was a brilliant leader, but he was also a very, very engaged partisan ANC politician. And what I tried to show was at critical moments he could put the country above party, but sometimes the party was everything. And this book, based, as we say, on my real-time experiences and encounters with him, tries to put that side of the picture forward. I hope to give a more rounded view, really, of what really, as J.M. Coetzee said, is probably the last of the great leaders in the world, never mind in this country.
As a discerning reader, though, you start off saying you almost hero worshipped him. You really, like the rest of us, but it goes through, as you go through the book, you realize as a reader that this was a man, not a god. This is someone who had made a few missteps along the way. And in fact, if the last conclusion that I came to from reading your story was that some of the seeds of the problems that we're dealing with right now, specifically corruption, cadre deployment, etc., could have been stamped out, could have been addressed by Mandela, but weren't.
Yes, and that is correct. In fact, there are 3 chapters here. I started with 1. It unfortunately got to 3 about what I called the blind spots of the Mandela era. And there were far more golden moments than blind spots, just to give it perspective, and that's why we remember, quite appropriately, Mandela so well and so fondly. But the point I make in the book is that Mandela uniquely had the moral authority, the stature, to stamp down on certain things. And at some critical moments, when the corruption scandal started on his watch, the Sarafina II saga with Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, more materially the Sol Kerzner bribe situation with Stella Sekau and the Transkei gaming licenses, which of course led to the expulsion of Bantu Holomisa, rather than actually any acknowledgement that the ANC had acted incorrectly in that matter, or indeed some of the leading personalities whom, to his credit, Bantu Holomisa, at the cost of his own very high position, the ANC exposed and was cast into the outer darkness, ironically only resurrected toward the end of Mandela's life when he was brought back by the family to an honoured place at Mandela's sickbed and ultimately at his funeral. And then there was a third element, which was a very underreported at the time, and that was the December 1997 Mafeking conference of the ANC, their 50th conference, where Mandela made a 4.5-hour speech, I kid you not, which people say it was written by Thabo Mbeki and it had been secondary drafts by Joel Netshitenzhe, but the truth is Mandela delivered it as the outgoing president of the ANC, which lambasted civil society, the media, all opposition parties, as being part of some counter-revolutionary movement, and green-lighted what we know today to be cadre deployment of ANC officials everywhere across society, in business and elsewhere. And I think some of those problems today that we experience and some of the challenges that you so eloquently identify on your various platforms as impeding economic growth and market economics taking off here started then. Now, that's not to say that Mandela wasn't having to balance a whole range of contradictions. And I, somewhere in this book, quote from that marvelous poem by Walt Whitman, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I am filled with multitudes." I mean, Mandela was a multi-dimensional person. He wasn't one thing or the other. He was several things. And when, toward the end of his life, people said, well, was he a communist or was he this? Bill Keller of the New York Times very perceptively wrote, it didn't really matter because he was an adaptive politician. And he didn't govern as a communist, and he didn't run a communist presidency, and he didn't bequeath South Africa a communist constitution. And I think that's so true as well. And I hope, in my own contribution to that history of our recent times, that I've tried to reflect on that complexity, but in an interesting and hopefully human way as well.
Alec also mentioned that you touched on the people that surrounded Mandela at the time. One such individual we spoke to earlier this week, Getso Gordhan, current chief executive of PPC.
He was a really essential to the whole ANC's electoral strategy. He was their campaign's chief in 1994. Incidentally, the ANC got the same percentage under Mandela as they got under Zuma 2 weeks ago. So some things don't change. But of course, Getso Gordhan, and I think I mentioned in the book, was also part of what you might call Mandela's economic kitchen cabinet. So he took advice, and the other guy, of course, was Tito Mboweni, who did me the honor of launching this book last night in Sandton. There were some really engaged people around Mandela who themselves didn't come from a business background, but today are very involved in business. But I really think, had a sensitivity to the needs of a market economy, as of course did Mandela. For all his revolutionary background, I do recount how when Derek Keyes was resigning quite suddenly as the Minister of Finance, Mandela left of dinner early to go and phone, the 4 business leaders of South Africa, Harry Oppenheimer, Anton Rupert, Marinus Darling, Donnie Gordon at that time. In those days, you could make 4 phone calls probably and cover the table, because he set enormous store by getting the buy-in, not just of his party, but of his advisors and of people way outside of the Mandela circle whom he believed were necessary to move South Africa forward, such as those very significant business leaders of the 1990s.
It's a lovely book. Great is difficult to say, but for people who've lived through it, who've tried to get a balanced perspective of it, there's so many of those little insights as you've now shared with us. But the one that we all forget was Mandela was very much an inclusive politician. He wanted you to join the cabinet.
Yes.
Now, looking back, might that not have been a smart thing to have done?
Well, that was, it was a really difficult decision to make, and because it came from Mandela, and I do call it in the book, the chapter is called The Temptation. It was the terms that he set in the end when I started having several discussions with him about what it would mean. He said, look, basically, you can criticize inside the cabinet, but you can't go outside and make your opposition to decisions we've arrived at collectively known. And I thought, well, that would be the death knell of the Democratic Party. And what I did in this book was to reflect, well, what would have happened if I'd got that? Because, I wouldn't also minded executive office and executing policy from the heart of government. And maybe some of my supporters, people like Bobby Godsell and the late Harry Oppenheimer, were very persuasive that I should take it. Other people like Van Zyl Slabbert and Helen Suzman said, don't touch it with a barge pole. So there was plenty of advice. But the thing that really decided was that we wouldn't really have been able to continue as an opposition party outside of that. And I just wonder 17 years later if South Africa would have an independent opposition, because at that stage in 1997, the Democratic Party was making the running as an opposition, although we only had 7 MPs. Now the Democratic Alliance got 89 MPs, but they might not have been 89 MPs if we'd been absorbed into government then. It's one of those what-if questions, Alex.
Why don't you throw me the book, because we'd like to...
Absolutely. Hopefully I've suitably inscribed it. Good.
We want to put it up there, but sometimes... where are we going? There we're going, over there. That's what the book looks like. So it's pretty easy to pick up. Very young-looking Tony Leon in the picture.
I was 20 years ago.
Wow. But sometimes being in the tent means you can make more of a change. And that's what I was interested in getting your view on. Had you been in the tent, you would have had more of a close-up view of what was going on rather than adversarial, which sometimes, what do they say? A thimble, a bucket full of bile is not as powerful as a thimble of honey.
Yes.
Well, you are reflective, so did you ever reflect on that?
I reflect on it for the last 17 years, particularly because I wondered, both those stories, would I have been able to do anything? What really put me off as well at the time was the ANC had just decided on cadre deployment, and they said you mustn't be ANC after hours. My friend Tito Mboweni actually said that, ironically. You have to be ANC all the time. And, I wouldn't have been able to appoint the Director General I wanted. It would have been someone from... the ANC background. The staff in the ministry would have been basically, a lot of them would have been ANC. And I don't know how much I would have been able, if I'd they said, look, you're going to be Minister of Public Enterprise, was suggested. But I'm a privatizer. I believe the government does not do things as efficiently as private enterprise. I would have been all in the forefront of selling off a lot of those enterprises to make them more competitive, to make them more efficient, and yet government policy would have been to the contrary. I mean, I did wrestle with this and resolve it much later on, when I stood down from Parliament, and President Zuma, quite generous, said, wouldn't I like to be an ambassador, subject of another book. And there I thought you can serve the state without being a member of the party, and I tried to do that in South America. Whether I could have done it here, well, it's one of those what-ifs. You see, I think the evidence was very finely balanced. And talking about business people, the late, and I regard him as a very great business leader, Les Boyd, who then was the deputy chairman of Anglo-American, one of my business informal consultants. I said to Les, I don't know what to do, you know, because on the one hand, this and the other. He said, follow your gut instinct. So I said, well, my gut keeps changing. He said, follow the first one. And the first one was that the terms of admission were tempting but were too high.
Just to close off with that, we are being told that our time has now come to an end. We have to go and listen to Vladimir Putin.
He's got real
world
power.
Exclusive.
Absolutely.
Would you ever go back into politics?
You know, I've been there, and I was 20 years an MP, 13 years leader of the party. I never say never, but I'm doing other things. And I, strange enough, think if you're not in the pit of partisan politics, important though it is for democracy, you can often have more influence, and you have a wider audience. I mean, when I was the leader of the DA, one looked at me through the lens of the DA, and I'd look at the world through the DA lens. Now, I don't do that, although obviously I'm part of what I was as part of me. I try and take a slightly wider view, and I do find, as you know from your very good writings, that it is better that way than just saying, I've got to bang the party drum.